Today I have the honor of sharing with you an account that was entrusted to me by someone who experienced something truly extraordinary. This person lived through an event so profound, so transformative, that it fundamentally changed their understanding of what life and death really mean. They have generously given me permission to share their story with you, with one important condition: that I change the names and locations throughout the narrative to protect their privacy and the privacy of their loved ones. I want you to understand something crucial. While I have adapted these personal details, every single spiritual element of this experience remains exactly as it occurred. Every encounter with divine beings, every revelation, every message from beyond, all of it is preserved with complete accuracy. The purpose of sharing this testimony is to bring you closer to the spiritual reality that surrounds us all, to strengthen your faith in God's presence in our lives, and to help you understand that what we call death is simply a doorway to something far more beautiful than we can imagine. My prayer is that this story will touch your heart and give you hope. May it remind you that we are eternal beings and that love never truly ends. Daniel Moretti had spent 23 years serving the people of the Pacific Northwest as a firefighter and emergency medical technician. In 1994, he was working at Rescue Station 18, which served the greater Portland, Oregon metropolitan area, and he approached his work with absolute dedication. Daniel wasn't the type to just show up for his shift and go through the motions. He genuinely cared about every single person he helped, treating each emergency call as if it were his own family member who needed assistance. He would stay late after shifts to check on patients he had transported earlier in the day. He remembered people's names and their stories. Outside of his professional life, Daniel was passionate about endurance athletics. He had completed numerous marathons and several full Ironman triathlon competitions throughout the Pacific Northwest. His physical conditioning was remarkable, his body operating like a precision instrument. But all of his strength, all of his training, all of his years of medical experience couldn't prepare him for what was about to happen that winter. A devastating flu epidemic had swept through Oregon and Washington that season, hitting the Portland area particularly hard. Medical facilities throughout the region were completely overwhelmed. Emergency rooms were filled far beyond their capacity, with patients on gurneys lining every available hallway. People were suffering terribly: high fevers, severe respiratory distress, dangerous levels of dehydration. Daniel and his crew at Station 18 were responding to medical emergencies non-stop. Every 12-hour shift felt like running a marathon. Every ambulance transport brought them face to face with another person fighting for their life, another family terrified and helpless as they watched their loved ones struggle to breathe. The entire emergency response system was stretched to its absolute breaking point, and there seemed to be no end in sight. One particular emergency call during that brutal flu season would alter the course of Daniel's life forever. He and his partner were dispatched to a residence in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside Portland city limits. When they arrived at the modest single-story home and were let inside by a worried neighbor, they found a woman confined to her bedroom. She had sealed herself away in there days earlier. Every window was covered with blankets to block out the light. The air in the room was thick, hot and stale. The woman was in desperate condition, her breathing coming in shallow, rattling gasps, her body burning with fever so intense that her skin was almost too hot to touch. She had been too weak to leave the bed for nearly 3 days, barely conscious, until the neighbor had heard her moaning through the wall and called for help. Daniel immediately shifted into emergency response mode. He climbed onto the bed and maneuvered himself into position so he could properly place an oxygen mask over her nose and mouth. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting the elastic straps around her head, checking to ensure the mask created a proper seal so she would receive maximum oxygen flow. But at the precise moment he leaned forward to verify the mask placement, the woman exhaled forcefully, coughing right into his face. Daniel inhaled at exactly that same instant. He felt the contaminated breath rush straight down into his throat and lungs. As a trained EMT, he knew immediately what had just happened. He had been directly exposed to whatever pathogen this woman was carrying. But he pushed the thought aside and stayed focused on his patient. He got her stabilized, helped his partner load her onto the stretcher, and they transported her emergently to the nearest hospital. Less than 2 days later, Daniel began feeling symptoms unlike anything he had experienced in his entire life. The illness attacked him with brutal force. His body temperature skyrocketed, climbing so high that he became disoriented and confused. Every muscle in his body felt like it was being torn apart. His joints ached with a deep, grinding pain that made even the smallest movement excruciating. His head pounded with such intense pressure that he couldn't tolerate any light or sound. But what terrified him most was the rapid, relentless dehydration. His body was purging fluids from every possible avenue. He couldn't keep anything down. Not water, not food, nothing. His digestive system was in complete rebellion. He could literally feel his body shutting down, his strength evaporating hour by hour as his organs began to fail from lack of fluids. On the 3rd day of this nightmare, Daniel attempted to get out of bed. His legs gave out immediately beneath him. He grabbed onto the nightstand to keep from collapsing completely and managed to half walk, half stumble to the bathroom. When he finally looked at his reflection in the mirror, he was shocked into a moment of terrified clarity by what he saw. The face staring back at him looked like something from a nightmare. His face had become skeletal. The skin pulled so tight over his cheekbones that it looked translucent. His eyes had sunken deep into dark hollows. His skin had taken on a grayish-yellow color that looked like death itself. He looked like a corpse that was somehow still standing. Daniel's medical training kicked in automatically. He reached down to check his radial pulse at his wrist, a basic vital sign assessment he had performed probably 10,000 times on patients throughout his career. He pressed his fingers against the inside of his wrist, searching for that familiar rhythmic beating. Nothing. He pressed harder, moved his fingers to different positions, tried the other wrist. Still nothing. He couldn't detect any pulse at all. His medical knowledge immediately told him what this meant. His blood pressure had dropped below 80 millimeters of mercury, possibly much lower. His heart was racing frantically, beating at what felt like 140 or 50 beats per minute. But his blood pressure was so critically low that the peripheral pulse in his wrists had completely disappeared. Daniel somehow managed to get back to the bedroom. He called out weakly to his family. His nephew, a college student who had been staying with them that week during a school break, heard his uncle's voice and came running. He took one look at Daniel and immediately understood that this was a life-threatening emergency. He grabbed the phone and dialed 911 without hesitation. Within 10 minutes, a Portland Fire Bureau rescue unit arrived at the house, colleagues and friends who had worked alongside Daniel for years. When they saw the condition he was in, their faces went pale. They immediately established 2 large-bore IV lines in his arms and began running normal saline wide open to try to replace some of his lost fluid volume. They loaded him onto their ambulance and transported him emergently, full lights and sirens, to a major trauma center in downtown Portland, approximately 25 minutes away, which had the resources and staffing to handle critical cases during the epidemic. When Daniel arrived at the trauma center's emergency department, the scene was absolute pandemonium. The waiting room was packed with people, many of them clearly very ill. Every treatment room was occupied. Gurneys lined the hallways with patients waiting to be seen. Medical staff were literally running from room to room, their faces etched with exhaustion from working impossible hours day after day, trying to manage the overwhelming patient volume. Daniel was wheeled into a treatment area where an emergency physician, who looked like he hadn't slept in days, was working frantically to manage what seemed like an impossible situation. The doctor had essentially implemented a standardized treatment protocol for all flu patients coming through his department. The approach was straightforward and practical given the circumstances: administer pain medication, usually a morphine-based analgesic, combined with anti-nausea medication to help patients tolerate oral fluids. The doctor was moving rapidly from patient to patient, barely glancing at individual charts anymore. He was simply trying to keep people alive and provide some relief from suffering while the epidemic ran its course. Daniel remained in that treatment bay for approximately 45 minutes. The intravenous fluids began to take effect gradually. 3 bags of normal saline flowed into his severely dehydrated system, and he started to feel marginally more human. His heart rate began to decrease slightly. The confusion in his mind started to clear just a bit. He managed to sit upright on the gurney and told his wife, who had driven separately to the hospital, that he thought he might be stable enough to go home now. They could continue treatment there with oral rehydration, he reasoned, and he would feel better recovering in his own bed. But the nurse who came to check on him explained that hospital protocol during the epidemic was very clear. Every patient presenting with this particular constellation of symptoms received the standard medication regimen before discharge, no exceptions. The emergency department was following strict guidelines to ensure consistency of care. Daniel, who had always respected medical authority and understood the importance of following protocols, simply nodded his agreement. He trusted the system. He had been a part of that system for over 2 decades. What happened in the next few minutes would haunt his wife's nightmares for years to come. The nurse prepared 2 syringes at the medication station, one containing Nubain, which is a potent synthetic morphine compound, and another containing a powerful antiemetic medication. Daniel was sitting upright on the edge of the gurney, actually beginning to stand up to get dressed and prepare for discharge, when the nurse approached and administered both medications directly into his IV port. She pushed them in quickly, emptying both syringes in rapid succession. Within seconds, maybe 5 or 10 at most, Daniel's eyes rolled upward and backward until only the whites were showing. His wife later described it as one of the most terrifying things she had ever witnessed. It looked unnatural, like something from a horror film. Then his entire body went completely rigid, every muscle locked in spasm. He toppled straight backward onto the gurney, hitting it hard, completely unconscious before his head struck the thin pillow. Immediately the treatment bay exploded with activity. Medical personnel came rushing in from every direction. A code was called overhead. Doctors and nurses swarmed around Daniel's gurney. They instantly recognized what was happening. Daniel was experiencing a severe adverse reaction to the medications, essentially a iatrogenic overdose, causing respiratory depression and cardiovascular collapse. Someone grabbed Narcan from the crash cart and administered it intravenously. Narcan is the emergency antidote for opiate overdoses. It works by instantly blocking opiate receptors throughout the body and reversing their effects. They gave Daniel 1 dose intravenously, then quickly followed with a 2nd dose. Additional IV access was established. The gurney was tilted into Trendelenburg position, head down, feet elevated, to try to maximize blood flow to his brain and other vital organs. But despite all of these aggressive interventions, Daniel's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly. His blood pressure had plummeted to 42/0. Essentially, his heart was still technically beating, but it wasn't generating anywhere near enough pressure to adequately perfuse his organs and tissues with oxygenated blood. The trauma team made an immediate decision to transfer him to the intensive care unit. They worked on him throughout the entire night, adjusting medications, monitoring his vitals minute by minute, doing absolutely everything possible to keep him alive. When morning arrived, and the ICU attending physician made his rounds, he sat down with Daniel's wife to explain in detail what had happened from a medical standpoint. The morphine-based medication Daniel had received caused something called systemic vasodilation throughout his entire circulatory system. The doctor tried to explain it in terms she could understand. Imagine your blood vessels, your arteries and veins, as a complex network of tubes filled with fluid, he said. Under normal conditions, those tubes maintain a certain diameter, and there's sufficient blood volume inside them to fill that space and create the pressure necessary for proper circulation throughout your body. But the medication Daniel received caused all of his blood vessels to dilate significantly. The walls of the tubes expanded dramatically. Suddenly, the volume of blood in his body, which had already been significantly depleted by 3 days of severe dehydration, was nowhere near sufficient to fill this expanded vascular space. His blood pressure collapsed catastrophically, and his body began to shut down. The doctor explained that, honestly, the only reason Daniel was probably still alive was his exceptional cardiovascular conditioning from years of competitive endurance athletics. His heart and circulatory system were so efficient, so well trained at delivering oxygen even under stress, that even with dangerously low blood pressure, his vital organs had managed to receive just barely enough oxygen to avoid complete and irreversible failure. Daniel never regained consciousness in any medical sense during that long night in the intensive care unit. His body lay motionless on that hospital bed, surrounded by beeping monitors and humming machines. But sometime between midnight and 2 o'clock in the morning, when his physical form was at its most vulnerable point, something absolutely extraordinary happened. Daniel left his body. The experience began with a sensation that he would spend the rest of his life trying to find adequate words to describe. It felt as if he had been trapped inside a cramped, hot, suffocating prison cell for as long as he could possibly remember, and suddenly, instantly, the walls simply vanished. He was released into boundless, infinite space. The relief was so overwhelming, so complete and total, that it brought him to a state of ecstatic joy beyond anything he had ever imagined possible. He found himself floating in a vast expanse of space, filled with massive, luminous spheres of different brilliant colors. These weren't stars as we see them in the night sky. They were conscious beings, entities composed of pure light and energy, and they radiated such unconditional love and acceptance that Daniel felt like he was being embraced by the universe itself. He understood immediately that these were what some spiritual traditions call light beings or angelic presences. But reading about them in books was nothing compared to experiencing them directly. This was real. This was immediate. This was more beautiful than anything he could have conceived of. Daniel himself no longer existed in physical form. He had become an expansive field of pure consciousness, without any boundaries or limitations whatsoever. The sensation was indescribably pleasurable, blissful beyond any comparison to physical pleasure. It was as if every atom of his being was vibrating with pure joy. If he had to try to describe it using physical analogies, he said it felt like warm, golden light was being poured directly into the core of his consciousness, and then radiating outward through every aspect of his existence, bringing everything alive with ecstasy and rapture. The pleasure was so intense, so all-encompassing, that it made every good feeling he had ever experienced during his physical life seem like a pale, faint shadow by comparison. It was like comparing a single drop of water to the entire Pacific Ocean. As he moved through this space, he described it as flying. Though there was no air or physical space in any conventional sense, surrounded by these welcoming, loving beings of light, a realization struck him with such force that it shook him to his very core. How had he forgotten? How was it even possible that he had been so completely, thoroughly convinced that he was Daniel Moretti, a firefighter from Portland, with a specific career and family and daily responsibilities and concerns and worries? Because standing there, or floating there, or simply being there, in that space, he knew with absolute, unshakable certainty that all of that was ultimately an elaborate illusion. His true identity, his authentic self, was this vast, eternal consciousness, this boundless being of light and love. The human life, the physical existence, the personality and memories and experiences of Daniel Moretti, all of it was like a costume he had put on for a play, a role he had agreed to perform, and he had become so deeply absorbed in the performance that he had completely forgotten he was an actor. The physical world, with all of its drama and pain and struggle and suffering, was a temporary experience, an intricate game that came with being born into a material body. But this realm of infinite light and unconditional love and limitless consciousness, this was home. This was ultimate reality. This was who he truly was and had always been. After what felt like both a single instant and an eternity, time simply didn't function normally in that realm. Daniel felt himself descending and landing somewhere. The sensation of floating through infinite space stopped, and he became aware of standing on something solid beneath him. He looked around with wonder and saw that he was inside some kind of facility or structure. It had walls that seemed to emit their own soft, gentle illumination from no identifiable light source. There were tables positioned throughout the space, and various pieces of equipment that he couldn't quite identify or comprehend. The whole place felt purposeful but also somehow playful and joyful, like a workshop where important but enjoyable work was being done. And then he noticed them. 3 short beings standing directly in front of him, watching him with obvious delight and amusement. These 3 beings were unlike anything Daniel had ever seen or imagined in his entire life. They stood approximately 3.5 feet tall, with compact, sturdy builds. They wore what appeared to be dark robes or cloaks with hoods, but the hoods were pushed back enough that Daniel could clearly see their faces. They looked somewhat like the gnomes or dwarves from fairy tales and mythology, with round, friendly faces and incredibly bright, sparkling eyes. And they were smiling, huge, genuine, ear-to-ear smiles that radiated pure joy, mischief, and profound love. Their eyes twinkled with playfulness and ancient wisdom. They reminded Daniel of excited children who had just been told they were going to Disneyland, except these beings were clearly timeless and infinitely wise despite their playful demeanor. The three beings immediately began asking Daniel questions in rapid succession, speaking in overlapping voices that had a musical, almost giggling quality to them. "How was your journey?" one asked with obvious enthusiasm. "Tell us everything you experienced," another exclaimed eagerly. "What did you discover down there? What did you learn?" The third one added, practically bouncing with excitement. They were like dear friends welcoming someone home after a long trip, eager to hear all about the adventure. Daniel stood there feeling somewhat disoriented and confused. He had an odd sense that he should recognize these beings, that they were somehow familiar to him on some profound level, but his memory felt clouded and unclear. He tried to gather his thoughts so he could respond appropriately to their enthusiastic questions. Then one of the three turned to his two companions, gestured toward Daniel with an amused expression on his face, and said something that made all three of them burst into delighted, infectious laughter. "Look at him. He doesn't remember us at all," the being announced cheerfully, and they all found this absolutely hilarious. They laughed and nudged each other affectionately, clearly finding tremendous humor and joy in the situation. Daniel wanted to protest, wanted to explain that he did feel some sense of recognition, that there was something familiar about them, even if he couldn't quite place it. But before he could form the words, his attention was drawn to another presence approaching from deeper within the structure. This new being was completely and utterly different from the three hooded figures. He was extraordinarily tall, perhaps 8 or 9 feet if you tried to measure him, and impossibly slender, with a form that appeared to be composed of luminous mist or vapor rather than any kind of solid matter. He reminded Daniel of a stretched, elongated version of those flexible clay animation characters, or perhaps like an impossibly tall, thin willow tree, except his entire body seemed to be made of swirling, glowing fog. When this being moved, it was absolutely mesmerizing to watch. Different parts of his form would drift apart gracefully and then flow smoothly back together, like watching someone move underwater, where gentle currents catch their clothing and hair and create beautiful, fluid patterns. Despite his unusual and otherworldly appearance, he had a distinct face, and that face wore the most beautiful, warm, radiant smile Daniel had ever witnessed in his life. His eyes were absolutely extraordinary, luminous, and filled with such profound, overwhelming love that Daniel could barely stand to look directly into them for more than a moment. This tall, misty being appeared to be overseeing the operation, though overseeing doesn't quite capture the right feeling or dynamic. There was no sense of rigid hierarchy or authoritarian control. Everything felt collaborative and joyful, like everyone was participating together in something wonderful and meaningful. When the tall being came close to Daniel, something powerful and overwhelming happened. Daniel felt his chest cavity expand dramatically, as if his heart was suddenly growing far too large for his body. At the exact same time, his throat constricted and tightened. A massive wave of overwhelming emotion crashed over him like a tsunami. He felt like he was about to break down into completely uncontrollable weeping, not from sadness or grief or pain, but from the sheer, overwhelming, almost unbearable intensity of the pure love radiating from this being. It was love so complete, so unconditional, so infinite and boundless that Daniel felt like he might simply dissolve into it. It felt like standing directly in the presence of divine love itself, being bathed in it, immersed in it, surrounded by it completely. The atmosphere in this space was surprisingly informal and unstructured. The three little hooded beings kept giggling amongst themselves, occasionally whispering to each other conspiratorially, and then bursting into more cheerful laughter. The tall, misty being just stood there radiating that absolutely overwhelming love, smiling gently and warmly, occasionally chuckling softly at something only he seemed to perceive. After several moments of this, Daniel decided he needed to take some initiative and move things forward. He looked up at the tall being and said, "Well, I'm obviously not going back there to that other place. So should we proceed with whatever comes next in this process? I've read about life reviews. Is that what we're going to do now?" He had encountered accounts of life reviews in near-death experience literature, the concept that you witness your entire life played back in vivid detail and experience the full consequences and impacts of all your choices and actions from every perspective. The tall being's response caught Daniel completely off guard and surprised him thoroughly. The being threw his head back and released a deep, rich, joyful laugh that seemed to resonate through Daniel's entire being. It was the kind of laugh that was so genuine and full of joy that it made you want to laugh along, even if you didn't understand what was funny. When the laughter subsided, the being looked down at Daniel with those impossibly loving, compassionate eyes and said warmly, "Sure, absolutely, let's do that. Where would you like to start? What would you like to talk about?" The complete casualness and informality of it stunned Daniel. This didn't match any of the structured, formal, serious life review processes he had read about in books and articles. Wasn't there supposed to be some kind of organized evaluation, some systematic accounting and judgment? But the being's demeanor was so relaxed, so friendly and welcoming, that Daniel simply decided to go along with it and see what happened. He began sharing some memories and stories from his life, but nothing particularly dramatic or weighty emerged from his consciousness. There were no terrible regrets weighing on his soul, no major sins requiring judgment or redemption or forgiveness. He mentioned one thing that came to his mind. Several years back, there had been an opportunity for him to take a position as a wilderness ranger in the Cascade Mountains. His wife had been really excited and enthusiastic about the possibility. They would have spent an entire summer season living in a remote ranger station, surrounded by pristine wilderness, away from the constant stress and trauma of emergency response work. But Daniel had declined the position, choosing instead to remain with the fire department, where he felt he could continue making a real difference in people's lives during their most desperate moments. Looking back now from this perspective, he found himself wishing he had accepted that ranger position. It would have been a beautiful, peaceful experience, a cherished season with his wife immersed in nature. That was honestly the only significant regret that surfaced in his consciousness. The tall being listened with patient attention, nodding occasionally, his expression radiating gentle understanding and complete acceptance. When Daniel finished speaking, the being smiled even more warmly and said kindly, "All right, that's sufficient for now. It's time for you to return." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Return. He stared at the being with complete disbelief and growing panic. "Return," he repeated, his voice rising with emotion. "No, absolutely not. There's no way I'm going back there. Are you serious right now? I'm finally home. I'm finally in the place where I truly belong." But the tall being's demeanor remained absolutely gentle, yet completely immovable and firm. "No," he said simply and clearly. "You have important work that still needs to be completed. You're going back to finish it." Daniel suddenly realized that the three little hooded beings had completely vanished. They had simply disappeared, presumably reassigned to other tasks or responsibilities in whatever this facility or realm was. Now it was just Daniel and the tall Misty being alone together. The being moved even closer, and Daniel knew with desperate certainty that he had to make one final attempt to stay in this beautiful place. He looked up with pleading eyes and said urgently, "Please listen to me. The only people who will genuinely miss me are my wife and my parents. Yes, they'll experience grief and sadness for some period of time, but they're remarkably strong, resilient people. They'll mourn appropriately, and then they'll heal emotionally, and they'll move forward with their lives successfully. They'll ultimately be okay. There's really no compelling reason for me to go back." Daniel genuinely thought this was a reasonable and logical argument, but the tall being simply found it touching and somewhat amusing. He smiled even more warmly, radiating compassion, and said again with absolute finality, "No, Daniel, you're going back now." In that precise instant, Everything around Daniel began to dissolve and disintegrate. It was exactly like watching a television picture fragment and break apart when you rapidly switch channels or lose the broadcast signal. The glowing walls, the tables, the mysterious equipment, the soft illumination, everything started to disintegrate and fade away into nothingness. Daniel understood intuitively and immediately what was happening to him. He was being shifted to a different vibrational frequency of existence. He realized in that profound moment that all of reality, absolutely everything that exists across all dimensions, operates on different vibrational frequencies, exactly like different stations on a radio dial. You can have completely different dimensions and realities occupying exactly the same space, just vibrating at different rates that normally can't perceive each other. He felt himself descending rapidly, sinking downward through multiple layers or levels of reality, and it was an unmistakable sensation of lowering, of decreasing in vibration and frequency. The tall being faded away gradually like morning mist, evaporating under the warmth of rising sunlight, and Daniel fell away into complete darkness. As he descended back toward his physical body, as he dropped down through these various layers or dimensions or frequencies of reality, he passed through a realm that filled him with profound dread and fear. For many years afterward, he was reluctant and hesitant to mention this particular part of his experience to anyone, but eventually he came to realize it was crucially important for people to know and understand. There exists a place, a dimension or realm, very close in frequency to our ordinary physical world, that you absolutely, positively do not want to visit or spend any time in whatsoever. It exists at a vibrational frequency just slightly different from our material reality, and it is a place of terrible, crushing loneliness and desolation. It is grey and empty and cold and lifeless. There is no love present there, no light, no connection between beings, no hope or joy of any kind. It's a realm of complete isolation and quiet, desperate despair. Daniel felt it pulling at his consciousness as he passed through it, like hands trying to grab him and hold him there. And he wanted absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with that place. It served as a stark and sobering reminder that not all non-physical dimensions and realms are beautiful and welcoming and filled with love. Some are genuinely dark and frightening and dangerous, and souls can apparently become trapped or lost there if they're not extremely careful. Then, abruptly and jarringly, he was back inside his physical body. The sensation was deeply uncomfortable, almost claustrophobic, like being forcibly stuffed back into a container or prison that was far too small and confining for what you had become. He remained medically unconscious for several more hours. When he finally began the process of waking up, it happened very gradually, in distinct stages. His first glimmer of awareness was of mechanical beeping and humming sounds, medical monitoring equipment operating around him. He managed to force his eyes open just slightly, just a crack, and saw machines and monitors all around him, with tubes and wires connected to various parts of his body. He focused his blurry attention on one particular monitor that was displaying his blood pressure reading. It showed 48/0. He stared at those numbers for several long moments, trying to process what they meant, then slipped back down into unconsciousness. Some indeterminate time later, he woke again briefly. The blood pressure reading had improved somewhat. It now displayed 64/32. He felt a small flicker of hope and relief before darkness claimed him once more. This pattern repeated itself multiple times over the next several hours, brief moments of partial awareness where he would check the monitor and see the numbers slowly, gradually climbing upward into the 70s and then the 80s, followed by periods of unconsciousness. Finally, during one of his conscious periods, a nurse entered the ICU room and saw his eyes open and focused. "Oh, thank God you're awake," she exclaimed, her voice filled with genuine surprise and profound relief. Daniel looked at her with confused eyes and said weakly, "I need to talk to you. I need to understand something." The nurse immediately shook her head. "First, I need to notify the attending physician right away," she explained quickly. "You've been unconscious for many, many hours. We honestly weren't at all certain you were going to survive this. The doctor absolutely needs to know immediately that you're alert and responsive." But Daniel reached out with trembling fingers and gently touched her arm. "Please, just for one moment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I desperately need to understand something. Why am I back here in this body, in this hospital room? I was somewhere else entirely. I was home, with beings I've known since the beginning of time. How did I end up back here in this place?" The nurse paused, pulled up a chair, and sat down beside his bed. She had undoubtedly witnessed many extraordinary things during her long nursing career, but something about Daniel's earnest confusion and genuine distress touched her heart deeply. Daniel continued, his voice trembling with emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I genuinely thought I had died. I was absolutely, completely certain of it. I was in a place that was infinitely more real than this hospital room, more real than anything I've ever experienced during my entire physical life. And now I'm inexplicably back here in this broken body, and I honestly, truly don't understand why this happened." The nurse reached out and took his hand in both of hers, squeezing it gently but firmly. She looked directly into his eyes with deep compassion and understanding, and said softly, "Sweetheart, you came incredibly, unbelievably close. In medical terms, we say you were circling the drain. But somehow, against all odds, you pulled through and came back to us. Now you're here in the land of the living once again, and as hard as it might be, you're just going to have to make peace with that reality and focus on getting yourself healthy and strong again." Daniel genuinely appreciated her honesty and her compassionate kindness, but her words provided very little actual comfort to his grieving heart. Throughout the next week of his hospital recovery period, he experienced a persistent, deep sadness that seemed to permeate everything. It wasn't the kind of severe clinical depression that requires psychiatric intervention and medication. He could still function adequately, could engage in conversations with visitors, could cooperate fully with the medical staff and physical therapists working with him, but underneath all of that normal functioning was a profound sense of loss and mourning that wouldn't go away. He grieved deeply for that other realm, that dimension of pure love and limitless joy and absolute freedom. He could feel the vivid memory already beginning to fade and blur, which only intensified his sadness and sense of loss. It was exactly like trying desperately to hold on to a beautiful dream, immediately after waking up, feeling all the precious details slip away through your fingers, no matter how hard you try to grasp and retain them. He knew with certainty that eventually, perhaps soon, he might even begin to seriously question whether it had actually happened at all, might start convincing himself it was just an elaborate hallucination caused by medication interactions and severe oxygen deprivation to his brain. But Daniel absolutely refused to allow the experience to be forgotten, dismissed, or relegated to the category of medical hallucination. So he made a conscious decision to start talking about it openly and honestly. He told absolutely everyone he encountered. He told his fellow firefighters and EMTs back at the station when he finally returned to work. He told friends, family members, neighbors, acquaintances, anyone who would listen for even a moment. He told them all essentially the same core message: "You need to listen to me very carefully. Death is not something we should fear or dread. We have completely and totally misunderstood what it actually is. It's not an ending or a tragedy or something terrible. It's a beautiful transition to something infinitely better than this physical existence. It's like graduating to a much higher level of existence and consciousness. It happens instantaneously. It's more beautiful than words can possibly describe, and there is absolutely nothing at all to be afraid of." Over the months and years that followed his near-death experience, people who were struggling terribly with grief and devastating loss would actively seek Daniel out specifically. A fellow firefighter whose young daughter had been killed in a tragic drowning accident, a close friend whose elderly father had recently passed away from complications of Alzheimer's disease, people who were absolutely drowning in overwhelming sorrow and couldn't begin to imagine how they would ever feel remotely whole or complete again. Daniel would sit patiently with each grieving person and share compassionately what he had learned through his extraordinary experience. "You absolutely must understand something fundamental about the nature of reality. Nobody actually, truly dies in the way we think they do. That's the crucial truth that changes absolutely everything about how we understand loss. When someone we love deeply passes away from this physical world, we haven't actually lost them in any ultimate sense. They've simply stepped out of their physical body, like taking off a coat, and returned to their true home, They're still completely and entirely themselves, still carrying the exact same personality you loved, still holding all their precious memories, still filled with all their love for you. They're just existing in a different dimension now, vibrating at a different frequency that our physical eyes and ears can't detect. And they're so much closer to you than you realize or can imagine. They're literally right here beside you at this very moment. You simply can't perceive them with your limited physical senses, but they are absolutely present and aware. Daniel would patiently explain to these grieving people that when he left his physical body and traveled through those extraordinary spiritual realms, his fundamental core identity remained completely and perfectly intact. His essential personality, his characteristic sense of humor, his particular way of thinking and processing information, that internal narrative voice that constantly runs in your head, making observations and cracking jokes and asking questions, all of that was still fully present and functioning. The transition from physical to non-physical existence was absolutely seamless and flawless. He didn't transform into a different person or lose any essential aspect of himself. He simply stepped out of his physical form, like removing a suit of clothes, and continued being Daniel, just existing in a radically different state of being and consciousness. And if that was unquestionably true for him, then it must be equally true for absolutely everyone. Every single person who has ever died throughout all of human history is still fundamentally themselves, still fully conscious and aware, just no longer confined to or limited by a physical body. They haven't actually gone anywhere in any real sense. They're simply vibrating at a frequency that our physical sensory organs cannot detect or perceive. This powerful message brought profound comfort and genuine hope to many people who were suffering through terrible grief. Several people told Daniel with tears in their eyes that his testimony had literally saved their lives, that they had been seriously contemplating suicide to escape their unbearable emotional pain, but his words had given them hope and helped them find the strength and courage to carry on living. Daniel felt deeply in his soul that this was a significant part of his purpose, a major reason why he had been sent back to physical life, to share this liberating truth, to help suffering people understand that death is not the ultimate tragedy and permanent ending we've all been culturally conditioned to believe it is. But then came the inevitable pushback and social pressure. After approximately 6 months of openly and enthusiastically sharing his near-death experience story with anyone who would listen, a longtime co-worker and friend approached Daniel one afternoon at the fire station. The man looked uncomfortable and awkward, but his message was unmistakable and clear. "Hey, Daniel, listen carefully," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "I'm telling you this as a friend who cares about you. Some people around here, including some administrators, are starting to talk and express concerns. They're saying you've been acting strange or odd, that maybe the experience and the medications affected you more profoundly than you realize. Some folks are privately suggesting you might really benefit from talking to a professional counselor or therapist about all this. I'm just saying, as your friend, you might want to be considerably more selective and careful about who you share this intense spiritual stuff with going forward." The words cut Daniel deeply and painfully. Here he was, earnestly sharing what he genuinely, absolutely believed was the most important, hopeful, liberating truth that any human being could possibly hear. Actual proof that death is not the final end, that we don't permanently lose the people we love, that there's an indescribably beautiful existence waiting for every single one of us. And he was being told to shut up about it, to keep quiet, because it made people uncomfortable or seemed crazy or mentally unstable. Daniel thought about other similar situations he had heard about throughout history. He knew that people who had profound spiritual experiences or mystical encounters often faced severe ridicule, persecution, or worse when they tried to share what they had learned with others. He was facing a difficult choice with real consequences: continue courageously speaking his truth and risk serious damage to his professional reputation and career, or stay silent and keep the transformative experience locked away inside himself, where it couldn't help anyone. Reluctantly, painfully, with deep sadness, Daniel made the difficult decision to stop talking about his experience publicly. He closed his mouth, locked the memories away deep inside himself, and tried to act completely normal. For the next 15 long years, he barely mentioned his near-death experience to anyone outside his immediate family. He went back to his regular work routine, continued his dedicated career in emergency services, competed in his athletic events and competitions, and lived what appeared from the outside to be a completely normal, ordinary life. But the vivid memory of that extraordinary night in 1994 never truly left him or faded away. It was always there, just beneath the surface of his everyday consciousness, quietly waiting for its moment to re-emerge. Then in 2010, Daniel retired from active firefighting and emergency medical service. He was in his mid-50s by that point, ready and eager to begin an entirely new chapter of his life journey. But almost immediately after he stopped working, as soon as he had abundant time to sit quietly in stillness and reflect deeply without the constant demands and distractions of emergency calls and training exercises and shift work, the memory of his near-death experience came flooding back into his consciousness with overwhelming, undeniable force. It was as if the experience had been dormant, held carefully at bay by the relentless busyness and structure and demands of his working life, and now it was demanding his complete and total attention. Daniel became absolutely consumed with finding deeper answers and achieving greater understanding of what had actually happened to him during those extraordinary hours. He began an intensive, obsessive personal research project, reading absolutely everything he could possibly find about near-death experiences, consciousness studies, quantum physics, spirituality, mysticism, and ancient wisdom traditions from cultures all around the world. He discovered that many traditional societies throughout human history, the mystics, the shamans, the indigenous wisdom keepers, the contemplative monks, had preserved and transmitted profound knowledge about the fundamental nature of reality and consciousness that modern Western civilization had largely forgotten, systematically dismissed, or even actively suppressed and hidden. But that fascinating journey of discovery and deeper understanding is truly a story for another time. What matters most profoundly for today, what Daniel wanted every person to know and understand, is this core truth. Death is absolutely not what we have been taught and conditioned to believe it is. It is not an ending, not a tragedy, not something to dread or fear with anxiety and terror. It is a transition, a homecoming, a return to our authentic nature as eternal beings of pure consciousness and unconditional love. The precious people we have loved and lost are not truly gone or annihilated. Our beloved pets and animal companions who have died have not ceased to exist. They are all still here, still present, living and thriving in frequencies and dimensions just slightly different from our ordinary physical reality, still completely themselves, still fully aware and conscious, still absolutely filled with love for us. And one day, when our own appointed time finally comes to leave these temporary physical bodies behind and return home, we will joyfully join them in that magnificent realm of infinite light and boundless love and eternal joy. That is Daniel Moretti's heartfelt testimony, and his deepest, most fervent hope is that by sharing his extraordinary story, he can bring genuine comfort, lasting peace, and real hope to anyone who desperately needs to hear it.